The sun over Granite Hollow did not just shine. It prosecuted the earth, demanding moisture from the soil until the ground cracked open in surrender. In the shadow of the jagged peaks that loomed over the settlement, Maylin moved with the silence of a ghost, a solitary figure draped in a gray, old prairie dress that had long ago surrendered its original color to the dust of the territory. The fabric was heavy, coarse against her skin, and stiff with the residue of her labor, blending perfectly with the slate and shale of the mountainside. She did not live in the wooden shanties that clustered nervously around the muddy main street, nor did she inhabit the whitewashed boarding house where the miners drank away their wages. Maylin lived in the throat of the mountain itself, occupying the abandoned mouth of the Copperhead Drift, a mine shaft that had run dry of ore a decade prior, but remained rich in darkness. To the townspeople of Granite Hollow, she was a specter, a tragic oddity left behind by a husband who had died coughing up the very dust she now swept from her stone floor. They viewed her residence not as a home, but as a grave she had simply forgotten to lie down in. When she descended into town to trade for flour or oil, the whispers trailed her like flies buzzing around a carcass. The women, fanning themselves on porches with handkerchiefs that smelled of lavender water, would tilt their heads and cover their mouths, their eyes darting from Maylin's worn boots to the heavy hem of her gray dress. They laughed, a tittering bird-like sound that lacked cruelty but brimmed with a condescending pity that was far worse. They mocked the woman who chose to live like a bat in a cave, surrounded by damp rock and eternal twilight, while they enjoyed the civilization of thin pine walls and glass windows. "She's gone mad with the grief," Miss Gable would say, loud enough for Maylin to hear as she inspected a sack of beans. "Living in the dirt like a varmint. It ain't Christian, and it certainly ain't proper." Maylin never responded. Her face remained a mask of calm porcelain, her eyes dark and unyielding. She knew what they did not. She knew the temperature of the earth was a constant thing, a promise kept by the mountain, while the wooden boxes they lived in were at the mercy of the wind's caprice. She paid for her beans with coins scrubbed clean of soot, hoisted the sack onto a shoulder strengthened by years of hauling rock, and began the long, steep climb back to the safety of the stone. The interior of the Copperhead Drift was not the damp, suffocating hole the townspeople imagined. It was a cathedral of shadows and controlled air, a testament to a specific kind of engineering that the surface dwellers had forgotten. Years ago, before the fever took him, her husband Chin had not just mined this rock. He had listened to it. He had taught Maylin that the mountain breathed, inhaling the cool night air and exhaling the earth's warmth, provided one knew how to tend the lungs of the shaft. Now, alone in the silence, Maylin practiced the rituals he had left her. The main chamber, reinforced with timbers of black oak that had hardened like iron over time, was swept immaculate. Her living space was separated from the deeper, dangerous drifts by a heavy curtain of canvas and wool she had stitched together by hand. In the center of the room stood a cast-iron stove, its flue pipe deftly routed into a natural fissure in the rock ceiling that Chin had identified as a thermal vent. Maylin moved through the space, her gray dress swishing softly against the stone floor. She paused at the back of the chamber, where the darkness deepened, and placed her hand against the wall. It was not cold. It hummed with a deep geological warmth, the heat of the planet's core seeping up through miles of granite. This was the wisdom Chin had imparted. Wood rots, canvas tears, but the mountain endures. "We do not fight the earth, May," he had told her, his voice raspy but gentle in her memory. "We wear it like a coat." She remembered the way his hands, scarred and strong, had shown her how to mix clay and straw to seal the cracks where the draft was too sharp, and how to leave the lower vents open to draw in oxygen. He had taught her that survival was not about conquering nature, but about alignment. Every morning she checked the airflow with a lit candle, watching the flame dance. If it pulled inward, the pressure was dropping outside. If it stood tall, the weather would hold. She was the steward of this stone vessel, maintaining a ledger of coal stocks, dried meats, and water barrels with a discipline that bordered on religious devotion. While the town below operated on the chaos of boom and bust, feasting one week and starving the next, Maylin lived by the steady, unhurried rhythm of the stone. As autumn bled into a particularly bitter November, the mockery from the town intensified. The men of Granite Hollow were busy expanding their homes, nailing up fresh, green lumber that hadn't had time to cure, confident that more wood meant more warmth. They saw Maylin hauling buckets of river clay up the mountain path, her gray dress spattered with mud, and they jeered. "Plaster in the tomb, are we?" a man named Barnaby shouted from the livery stable, eliciting a round of guffaws from his companions. Maylin did not break her stride. She was focused on the thermal seal of her entryway. She had spent weeks fashioning a second door, an airlock of sorts, creating a buffer zone to trap the heat. It was grueling work. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked and stained with the red clay of the riverbank, but she did not stop. She knew the signs that the others ignored. The squirrels had vanished weeks ago. The erratic flight of the geese had signaled a panic in the natural world. The air tasted metallic, like a blade held against the tongue. It was during one of these arduous trips that Gabriel, the town's wheelwright, crossed her path. Gabriel was a man of few words, built broad and sturdy like the wagons he repaired. He did not laugh with the others. He had watched Maylin from a distance for years, noting the straightness of her spine and the efficiency of her movements. He saw her struggling with a particularly heavy pail of clay near the edge of the creek. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the semi-frozen mud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and rumbling. He reached out, not to take the bucket, but to steady it as she slipped. "The frost is deep this year. That mud is heavy." Maylin looked up at him, her guard instantly raised. She expected a joke, a comment about her living in a hole, but Gabriel's eyes were clear and devoid of malice. "The wood down there," he gestured to the town. "It's warping already. The cold is shrinking it." It was an admission of vulnerability she had never heard from a man of the town. Maylin tightened her grip on the bucket handle. "Stone does not shrink," she said quietly. "It only waits." Gabriel nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He didn't offer to carry her burden. He knew she would refuse. But he tipped his hat, a gesture of respect that burned brighter than the winter sun. "Be safe up there, Maylin," he said, using her name for the first time. The sky turned the color of a fresh bruise 3 days later. It wasn't the gray of rain, nor the white of simple snow. It was a churning, violent purple that swallowed the peaks and erased the horizon. The air pressure dropped so plummeting low that the ears of the livestock in the valley popped, sending the horses into a frenzy of kicking and biting in their stalls. In the mine, Maylin felt the shift in her bones. The candle flame by the door flickered wildly, then bowed almost horizontal, pointing toward the interior of the mountain. The vacuum was forming. The storm was not just coming, it was hunting. She moved with practiced haste, engaging the protocols she had rehearsed 1,000 times in the quiet dark. She pulled the heavy inner door shut, dropping the thick timber bar into place. She checked the seals on the clay she had applied, running her sensitive fingertips over the dried surface to detect even the slightest whisper of a draft. Outside, the wind began to scream. It was a sound that defied description, a shrieking chorus that sounded like metal being torn apart. Maylin lit the cast-iron stove. She did not use the quick-burning pine the townspeople favored. She used the dense, anthracite coal she had scavenged and hoarded from the deeper veins of the mine, fuel that burned slow and hot. As the stove ticked and pinged with rising heat, she sat on her simple wooden stool, smoothing the skirts of her gray prairie dress. She was a tiny island of calm in a world that was about to be unmade. Down in the valley, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not soft flakes, but shards of ice driven horizontally like buckshot, shattering against the thin glass panes of the optimistic wooden houses. The crisis arrived with the suddenness of a guillotine blade. Night fell at 3 in the afternoon, strangled by the density of the blizzard. In Granite Hollow, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees in the span of an hour. The green wood of the new houses, filled with moisture, froze and split with sounds like gunshots. Nails popped from their purchase as the timber contracted violently. Windows rattled by the gale force winds blew inward, showering living rooms with glass and snow. Panic, cold and sharp, seized the town. Fireplaces roared, but the chimneys, poorly drafted and battered by the downdraft, belched smoke back into the rooms, forcing families to choose between freezing to death or suffocating. Gabriel stood in his workshop, watching his breath plume in the air like thick fog. He had boarded his windows, but the wind was finding every gap, whistling a high, mocking tune. He could feel the cold radiating from the walls, a physical weight pressing against him. He looked at his thermometer. The mercury had retreated into the bulb. He thought of his neighbors, the widow Gable, the families with small children, the elderly who had mocked the woman on the hill. Then he looked up toward the mountain. Through the swirling white blindness, high up on the ridge, he saw it. A faint, steady orange glow emanating from the vents of the Copperhead Drift. It was a beacon. It was a heartbeat. While the town below was breaking apart under the assault of the White Death, the mine was breathing. Gabriel grabbed his heavy coat and his lantern. He knew the pride of the town was freezing along with their marrow. Someone had to break the social contract before the cold took them all. He opened his door and the wind nearly tore it from its hinges, but he pushed out into the white void, his eyes locked on that single, impossible spark of warmth in the darkness. The ascent to the Copperhead Drift was a journey through a white hell that stripped Gabriel of his senses one by one. The wind howled with such ferocity that it became a physical weight pressing against his chest, trying to hurl him back down into the freezing valley. His lantern was a useless, flickering joke in the face of the gale, illuminating nothing but the swirling chaos of ice crystals that slashed at his exposed skin like ground glass. He navigated by memory and by the gradient of the slope, his hands numb inside his gloves, his boots slipping on the treacherous shale hidden beneath the drifts. Every step was a battle against the instinct to lie down and sleep, the seductive whisper of hypothermia already creeping into the edges of his mind. He was not climbing a mountain. He was climbing out of a grave. When he finally reached the leveling near the mine entrance, he fell more than he walked, crashing against the heavy timber door. He pounded on it with a fist that felt like a block of wood, the sound swallowed instantly by the shrieking storm. He shouted, but his voice was torn away. He slumped against the rough wood, resigned to the fact that the stone, indifferent and sealed, would be his headstone. Then the miracle of friction and leverage occurred. The heavy bar inside lifted with a dull thud. The door cracked open, and a hand, small but gripping with the strength of iron, hauled him into the thermal lock. Gabriel collapsed onto the stone floor, gasping for air that didn't burn his lungs. Maylin stood over him, the candlelight catching the sharp angles of her face and the worn fabric of her gray prairie dress. She did not ask foolish questions. She did not ask why he was there or what he wanted. She simply secured the outer door, checking the seal with a practiced swipe of her hand, and then opened the inner curtain. The heat that hit Gabriel was not the suffocating, smoky heat of the town's failing fireplaces. It was a deep, radiant warmth that seemed to emanate from the center of the earth. He looked up at her, water dripping from his beard onto the immaculate floor. "The town," he rasped, his voice cracking. The roofs are caving in. The wood is splitting. The children, they won't last the night." Maylin looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the silence stretched, heavy with the weight of years of mockery, of laughter, of being treated like a scavenger in her own home. She could have closed the curtain. She could have told him that the ant does not owe the grasshopper a living. Instead, she turned to her shelves, her eyes scanning the rows of supplies. "The lower drift is dry," she said, her voice steady and devoid of triumph or malice. "It holds the heat well, but we cannot carry them. They must walk." She grabbed a coil of heavy hemp rope and a second lantern. "Can you stand, Gabriel?" He nodded, forcing his frozen limbs to obey. She didn't offer pity, she offered a plan. The descent back into Granite Hollow was a nightmare of coordination and brute will, a tethered march into the teeth of the apocalypse. Maylin moved with a sure-footed grace that baffled Gabriel. She knew every twist of the path, every hidden drop-off, sensing the terrain through the soles of her boots even under the snow. When they reached the cluster of houses, the scene was one of utter devastation. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and windows were shattered jagged maws. The people were huddled in the wreckage of the saloon, the only structure with walls thick enough to offer temporary respite. But even there, the cold was winning. The fire was dying, the chimney choked with downdrafts. When the door burst open and Maylin stepped in, followed by a snow-blinded Gabriel, the silence that fell over the shivering crowd was absolute. They looked at the woman in the gray dress, the mad widow of the mine, and they saw their own arrogance reflected in her dark eyes. There was no time for apologies. "Tie the rope to your waists," Maylin commanded, her voice cutting through the whimpering of the wind. "Children in the middle, do not let go. If you let go, the mountain takes you." The pride of Granite Hollow died that night, frozen in the drifts, replaced by a desperate animal need for survival. Men who had laughed at her cave now scrambled to obey her, lashing themselves together with trembling fingers. Mrs. Gable, her face pale and waxy with cold, clutched a bundle of blankets that held her youngest grandchild, looking at Maylin with eyes wide with terror and shame. Maylin did not look back. She was already checking the knots, testing the tension. She took the lead position, the point of the spear against the storm. The climb back up was a slow, agonizing procession. Maylin broke the trail, her body acting as a shield against the wind for those behind her. She did not falter. Every time the line stalled, every time someone collapsed in the snow crying that they could go no further, she was there. Not with soft words, but with a sharp tug on the rope and a relentless forward momentum. She was the engine of their salvation, a small gray figure pulling the weight of the entire town up the spine of the earth. She was proving, step by brutal step, that the stone did not yield, and neither did she. Inside the Copperhead Drift, the transition was jarring. The survivors tumbled into the main chamber, their eyebrows frosted with ice, their lungs burning. They expected a damp, dark hole. What they found was a fortress of civilization. The air was warm and dry, circulating with a subtle, rhythmic draft that kept the atmosphere fresh despite the sudden influx of bodies. Maylin directed them with the efficiency of a field medic. "Do not crowd the stove," she ordered, pointing the men toward the lower drift she had prepared. "The rock holds the heat. Spread out. Sit on the blankets." She moved among them, passing out 10 cups of hot broth made from dried beef and roots, food she had preserved while they were buying lace and liquor. The townspeople looked around the mine with wide, comprehending eyes. They saw the intricate system of vents, the stockpiles of coal categorized by burn rate, the shelves of preserved food lined up with military precision. They saw the madness they had mocked was actually a genius of logistics. The mine was not a tomb, it was a living machine, and Maylin was its operator. She adjusted the flue of the stove to account for the extra oxygen consumption, her movements precise and automatic. Mrs. Gable sat near the wall, her hand pressed against the warm granite. She looked at the clean floor, the sturdy supports, and then at the woman in the gray dress who was currently checking the pulse of an elderly man. The shame in the room was palpable, thicker than the steam rising from the cups. They were guests in the home of the outcast, kept alive by the very eccentricity they had scorned. Gabriel watched Maylin from the corner. He saw the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she favored her left leg after the climb. But he also saw a fire in her that the storm could not extinguish. She was not serving them out of servitude. She was serving them out of a code they had failed to understand. The code of the steward, the one who watches the horizon while others watch their feet. The storm raged outside, burying their wooden houses, erasing their property lines, and leveling their hierarchy. But inside the mountain, under the protection of the widow, they were safe. Morning broke with a silence so profound it felt heavy. The wind had died, leaving behind a world sculpted in blinding white. Maylin was the first to wake, though in truth she had not slept. She sat by the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the steady rise and fall of chests in the dim light of the lantern. One by one the townspeople stirred. They woke not to the biting frost of their drafty bedrooms, but to the smell of charcoal and earth. When Gabriel unbarred the outer door and pushed it open, a wall of snow twice the height of a man stood there, but the top quarter was open to a sky of piercing, innocent blue. The town of Granite Hollow was gone, buried under 10 feet of snow. Only the mine, high on the wind-scoured ridge, remained accessible. The survivors crowded the entrance, looking down at the blank white sheet that covered their lives. There was no laughter now. The days that followed were a lesson in humility. The townspeople, trapped in the mine until the drifts could be cleared, lived by Maylin's rules. They learned to ration, they learned to listen to the ventilation, and they learned to respect the silence. The social order had inverted. The banker and the mayor were useless here. The hero was the woman who knew how to bank a fire to last 12 hours. When the thaw finally began, and the path to the valley was clear enough to traverse, the departure was somber. There were no boisterous goodbyes. As they packed up their meager belongings, Mrs. Gable stopped in front of Maylin. The older woman reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the sleeve of the gray prairie dress, the same dress she had ridiculed for its dullness. "It is warm," Mrs. Gable whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It is the warmest thing I have ever known." She didn't just mean the fabric. Maylin nodded, a slight softening in her gaze. "The mountain shares," she said simply. "We only have to listen." One by one the neighbors filed out, each nodding to Maylin, acknowledging a debt that could never be fully repaid with coin. They went down to rebuild their wooden boxes, but they would build them differently this time, with thicker walls and humbler hearts. Spring arrived in the territory with a violence of greenery, the snowmelt feeding rivers that roared through the canyons. The town of Granite Hollow was rising again, but the eyes of the people often turned toward the dark mouth of the Copperhead Drift with a reverence usually reserved for churches. But the mine was no longer a hermitage. The path up the mountain was worn smooth, not by the footsteps of a lonely ghost, but by the boots of a man who climbed it every evening. Gabriel had not just found shelter in the storm, he had found a foundation. He and Maylin did not court with the frivolous giggling of the town's youth. Their courtship was in the quiet sharing of labor, in the repair of the lower vents, in the silence that was comfortable rather than empty. He brought her fresh lumber, seasoned and true. She showed him how to anchor it to the stone so it would never shift. The wedding took place in late May, on the flat ridge outside the mine entrance. It was not a grand affair by the standards of the city, but it was the most attended event in the history of the settlement. Every soul from Granite Hollow stood on the rocky slope. Maylin did not wear white silk. She wore a dress of slate blue wool, tailored by her own hand, sturdy and elegant, matching the color of the mountains at twilight. Gabriel stood beside her, his hand firmly holding hers, his face beaming with a pride that had nothing to do with vanity. The minister spoke of rocks and shelters, of storms and sanctuaries. When he pronounced them man and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd echoed off the granite peaks, a sound of genuine joy that chased away the last shadows of the winter's prejudice. They did not move down to the town. They expanded the drift, building a home that was half stone, half timber, a bridge between the earth and the sky. You see, the world will always have its seasons of chaos. There will always be storms that shatter the fragile structures of the complacent, and there will always be crowds that mock the one who builds an ark before the rain begins. It is easy to stand in the sunshine and laugh at the one wearing a coat, but when the sky turns black and the wind comes for what you thought was safe, the laughter dies, and the only thing that matters is who kept the lamp lit. The wisdom of the outcast is often the survival of the whole. So, when you see someone building a foundation that makes no sense to your sunny day, do not scoff. Look at the horizon, check the wind, and ask yourself, when the cold comes, and it always comes, will you be the one knocking at the door, or will you be the one holding the key?